I'm not stepping anywhere until you show me the warrant.
Ma'am, you need to cooperate.
We don't have to show you anything right now. That's not true.
That's not true. The Fourth Amendment says otherwise.
You're interfering with a police investigation. You keep this up, you could be detained.
Then detain me. Without a warrant, this is illegal.
He was sure he was pressuring just an average resident and that the door was about to open under his shouting and threats. He didn't know that the person on the other side of the door chain had spent years sending officers just like him to trial and destroying their careers. This mistake cost him his badge, his reputation, and cost the city budget more than $8 million. Watch until the end to see the moment the smugness on the cop's face was replaced by pure terror as he realized exactly who he was trying to break. At 7:15 in the morning, the door to the loft shuddered from a heavy blow, and an officer in a tactical vest coldly stated that they had a warrant and she needed to step aside. It was said in the tone of a man used to never being questioned. But the woman behind the door didn't move an inch. She realized immediately that right in this moment the police were making a mistake that would cost them too dearly, and they hadn't yet realized what they had just set in motion. It was a Saturday in Philadelphia, an ordinary morning when the city hadn't fully woken up yet. Jasmine Carter had just returned from a run, showered, and was brewing coffee in her kitchen on the top level of a converted warehouse. No guests, no secrets, no reason for a visit from men with badges. She opened the door, leaving the chain on, and calmly demanded to see the warrant, because she knew that the law begins at that exact moment. But that was only the start. In response, the lead officer, Detective Derek Mullins, a 42-year-old veteran with 15 years of service, threw out a line claiming the police weren't obligated to show her anything. It was a blunt and brazen distortion of basic rules, but he counted on it being enough. Standing before him was a young black woman in loungewear, and in his head he had already constructed a narrative of who she was and how quickly she would back down. He was acting not on facts, but on profiling, and that is precisely what destroyed him. Jasmine calmly reminded him of the Fourth Amendment and that entering without presenting a warrant was a constitutional violation. Mullins immediately raised his voice, accusing her of interfering with a police investigation and hinting at a possible arrest. He pressed with authority and his usual threats because this tactic had worked dozens of times before. But this time, he didn't yet understand that he was pressing on the wrong person. While the argument continued at the door, two other officers began operating downstairs. They intercepted a neighbor, James Torres, a quiet 31-year-old designer who was simply leaving the building. They pinned him against the wall, asking questions about stashes and illicit substances that didn't exist, demanding a confession. James confusedly repeated that he had nothing to do with anything and just lived there, a moment that revealed the true cost of such raids. But even that wasn't all. The reason for the visit wasn't him, but his brother Carlos, a troubled man the police had been tracking for months. Officers had seen Carlos enter the building once and leave with a bag, and that was enough for them to fabricate a whole theory. They didn't know which apartment he had visited, and they had no real evidence of drug storage. So they chose the tried-and-true path, a warrant written for the entire building, filled with exaggerations and fabricated details. Mullins, who had already been investigated twice by Internal Affairs for questionable searches, was walking the line again. The warrant featured a non-existent confidential informant, several allegedly suspicious visits, and vague wording. The document had been submitted on a Friday afternoon when judges are in a hurry to finish work, and it was signed without thorough scrutiny. He was used to such papers opening any door. But this time, the door didn't open. When pressure and threats failed, Mullins tried to switch tactics. He began talking about alleged exigent circumstances, hinting at smells and noises that could justify an immediate entry. It was an attempt to create a pretext on the fly, to establish a cover story verbally. Jasmine immediately pointed out that he was manufacturing probable cause retroactively and demanded the case number and the name of the sergeant authorizing the action. He hesitated, and that pause spoke louder than words. Then came the moment that flipped everything. Jasmine stated her title and revealed that she was an assistant United States attorney specializing in police corruption cases. She clarified that if they entered without properly presenting the warrant, Federal charges would be filed by early next week. It didn't sound like a threat, but like a dry notification of consequences. In that moment, the officers' faces changed, and for the first time that morning, Mullins felt a chill. He finally handed over the warrant, and Jasmine read it in its entirety, line by line. She asked questions about the confidential source, dates, and specific facts that were missing from the document. Every answer Mullins gave only highlighted the obvious violations. When she mentioned Judge Patricia Morrison and said she knew her personally, the situation became irreversible, and he realized he had made a fatal step. The decisive blow came with a simple question about his past. Jasmine asked if he was the same Derek Mullins who had already been investigated twice for problematic warrants. Silence hung in the hallway, and the choice became crystal clear. Either back down right now or face a federal case for deprivation of rights under color of law, where the potential punishment is measured in decades of imprisonment. He backed down, but karma had already been set in motion. After they left, the story didn't end. That same day, attempts were made to rewrite what happened in the reports, adding language about aggressive behavior by the residents. Jasmine moved faster, requesting security camera footage and notifying leadership and investigative bodies to preserve all evidence. By evening, several investigations were opened simultaneously, and the system, usually accustomed to covering for its own, began to crack. But the main blow was yet to come. By the start of the week, Mullins was placed on administrative leave, and his warrants from previous years were pulled for review. Federal agents discovered a pattern, not a coincidence. 27 searches had the same issues as the morning visit to Jasmine. It turned from a single incident into a massive case against an entire unit. The court was the final stop for Mullins. His defense argued it was a good faith mistake, but the identical wording and false sources destroyed that version. The sentence was harsh: 8 years in federal prison, the end of his career, and the loss of his pension. His partners avoided jail but left the force, realizing that trust was lost forever. The city paid for years of turning a blind eye. A wave of lawsuits from illegally searched individuals led to settlements totaling over $8 million. Several convictions were overturned, people were released, and the unit Mullins worked in was disbanded. The police introduced mandatory legal review of warrants, body cameras, and additional training because they no longer had a choice. It all started with one morning and one refusal to step aside. Mullins thought he was facing another nameless target, but he ran into someone who knew the law and had the power to enforce it. He didn't realize that his confidence and profiling would become the trigger for his own reckoning. And so, an ordinary attempt at an illegal search turned into a lesson that karma sometimes arrives in the form of a read warrant and a closed door. The tension in the hallway thickened with every passing second. Detective Mullins was still trying to save face, but a frantic energy had crept into his movements, the kind that betrays a man who has lost control of the situation. He raised his voice, made sharp gestures, and repeated over and over that he was acting legally, as if repeating the lie enough times could turn it into fact. Jasmine stood opposite him calmly, almost motionless, and it was this composure that affected him more than any screaming could. He was furious that the victim wasn't afraid the way she was supposed to be. She sensed the risk and understood she was facing armed men used to obedience. But the fear didn't show. Inside was the cold confidence of a person who knows where the line of the law lies and knows that crossing it brings inevitable retribution. Mullins, however, was moving forward on inertia, blinded by his own arrogance and years of impunity. He still believed this was just a stubborn civilian he could crush. At one point he sneered, asking who she thought she was anyway. The question was asked with mockery, with that smug smirk worn by people convinced of their superiority. And that was when Jasmine, in a steady voice, announced that she was an assistant United States attorney working on corruption cases within law enforcement. The words were spoken without fanfare, but the effect was instantaneous. The smugness on Mullins' face was replaced by confusion. He blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly, then frowned, trying to gauge if it was a bluff. A second later, his confidence began to crumble. When she added that come Monday morning, this warrant would be on the desk of federal investigators, and that his name was already well known from past inquiries, the fear became obvious. His jaw clenched, his lips went pale, and his eyes darted around, seeking support from his partners who had suddenly chosen silence. He realized that standing before him was not just someone who knew her rights, but someone capable of turning his morning into the beginning of the end. His hands, which had been resting confidently on his gear just moments ago, trembled slightly. His voice grew quieter, his sentences shorter. In that moment, he realized for the first time that all his previous threats and pressure would now be documented and used against him. Confidence gave way to panic, and panic to the understanding of inevitability. The reckoning did not take long. Within days, Mullins was suspended, his badge and gun seized, and his name was in the local headlines. The investigation exposed a chain of violations that he had gotten away with for years. The trial was swift and deliberately harsh. He was fired in disgrace, stripped of his pension, and then found guilty of abuse of power and official misconduct. The city also bore responsibility for its employees' actions. A civil lawsuit from the affected residents ended in a settlement of $8 million, a painful blow to the budget and reputation. For the department, it was a public humiliation. For the public, it was a rare instance where the system at least partially admitted its guilt. Mullins went from a man used to giving orders to a symbol of how blind rage and stupidity can destroy a career and a life. This story showed that the problem isn't just one officer, but a mechanism that allowed such things to happen for too long. When power meets no resistance, it begins to think it is above the law. But as soon as the system encounters someone who knows the rules and demands they be followed, the cracks become visible to everyone. Change is only possible when violations face consequences, not excuses. If you think the guilty party got what he deserved, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations.